So now we're going to ask Jessica Marglin and Lior Sternfeld to take the podium and continue our conversation, focusing on Jews and Muslims in modernity, colonialism, and nationalism. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chava, for the invitation to participate in this wonderful conference, and I want to thank all the organizers, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the same panel with one of my favorite historians. So I'll introduce the speaker, Jessica Marglin. Jessica Marglin is an associate professor of religion, law. Just a second, now my text is okay. Of religion, law, and history, and the Ruth Ziegler Early Career Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Southern California. She earned her PhD from Princeton and her BA and MA from Harvard. Her research focuses on the history of Jews and Muslims in North Africa and the Mediterranean, with particular emphasis on law. And she wrote the magnificent book Across Legal Lines that is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand better the legal system in Morocco. And with no further ado, I give the microphone, the virtual microphone, to Jessica.
Thank you so much, Lior, for this introduction. Thank you, Chava, for the wonderful invitation. And I'll just say it is an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you virtually. It would only be improved if we could be here, if we could be together three-dimensionally, as they say, which would be even more fun. But I have to say, I've been so impressed. Obviously, I expected all of the presentations and the responses to be of incredibly high quality because of the people that you've invited, but I've been incredibly impressed with the questions so far as well. You out there, you audience, you're incredibly engaged and informed, and that's such a pleasure. So I hope that will continue in this session. I'll say, first of all, let me go ahead and share my screen to make sure that the slideshow is working and all of that. And I'll just say that, the task that I've been given is, of course, as I think is true for everybody, something of an impossible one, just because we can't possibly cover the history of Jews and Muslims in modernity, colonialism, and nationalism in half an hour. So obviously I will have to be partial in what I talk about. And what I've decided to do, for I think both, self-serving reasons and sort of more legitimate intellectual reasons, is to focus on a few case studies. So I will focus on North Africa, which is my area of specialty, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. I'm also going to look at Egypt and Iraq, which were both under British rule for various periods. This is partly because these places had very large Jewish populations, partly because they represent the French and British empires, which of course were the most powerful, important empires in the 19th and 20th centuries. But there's no way that this covers the expanse and diversity of the Jewish experience in the 19th and 20th century in the modern world, or of Jews' experience under colonialism and Jews' experience with nationalism. I'm leaving out incredibly important places, right? The sort of core areas of the Ottoman Empire, Anatolia and the Balkans, Palestine, which really would be its own talk, of course, Palestine, and then eventually the creation of the State of Israel, Yemen, Persia. I'm leaving out in part because I'm counting on you, Lior, to talk about Persia and Iran when in your response, so I'm just not going to say anything. But in any case, I really do welcome questions about all of the things that I'm not saying, in addition to all of the things that I'm saying. And before I get started with sort of the nitty gritty, I just want to highlight a few themes that I'll try to touch on today. One is the distinction that I want to make between colonization and westernization. And these two processes, you could say even phenomena, I suppose, don't necessarily go together, especially in the case of Jews. And I want to talk today in large part about the ways in which Jews in particular encountered European culture, bourgeois ideology, quote, the West, to put it very simply, in ways that were often distinct from colonization, often occurred well before colonization, and also often sort of set the stage for a particular relationship with colonization. I also really want to try, and I want to encourage all of us to try when we're thinking about this history, to resist teleology, right? Obviously, we know that eventually the vast majority of Jews left the Middle East and North Africa after the creation of the State of Israel mainly. But I really want to encourage us to think about the period before 1948 as one in which that departure was not inevitable. And that actually it wasn't obvious to the Jews or Muslims living in the MENA region at the time that that was going to happen. And finally, I do want to say that there was just enormous variety in Jews' experience throughout this period in the 19th and 20th century, especially when it comes to the question of departure and the question of the relationship with nationalism and Zionism. This is something that I'll hopefully, I'll be able to touch on a little bit, but I'll only really be able to touch on it. And I think it's incredibly important, in particular, because of the way that the departure of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa in the modern period is often politicized and sort of used for particular political ends, and thus homogenized in a way that I think is historically inaccurate, not to mention, not that useful. Okay. With that being said, I'm going to move right along because, of course, we don't have an enormous amount of time. So this is a map, right? So Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, this is a contemporary map. I'll focus on Iraq and Egypt. Egypt looks like it's part of North Africa, and of course, geographically it is, but actually for historians of the Middle East and North Africa, it's really considered part of the Mashriq, which is sort of the eastern part of the Middle East. So just so you don't think I'm only talking about North Africa. I'll start with the history of colonization in Algeria, because Algeria was the first part of this region to be colonized in 1830. I'll just note that this is true actually not just Algeria, but for really across North Africa, that Jews were a pretty small minority in North Africa. They made up something like 1 to 3% of the overall population, but their prominence was sort of outsized, in part because there were higher concentrations of Jews in the major cities. And so places where there were elites and places where there was a concentration of political power also had a higher concentration of Jews. And then also because Jews were often very sort of prominent in international relations. So when it came to colonization, Jews also often played an outsized role. And we'll see that very clearly with the history of Algeria. So as I mentioned, Algeria is initially colonized in 1830. Of course, it's a process of conquest. It doesn't all happen right away. In 1848, actually, the 3 northern provinces of Algeria, the province of Oran, Algiers, and Constantine, here you can see this map, are actually annexed to France. So they become part of metropolitan France, sort of the way Alaska or Hawaii are part of the United States, even though they're not physically contiguous to the United States. So that's part of the reason that the Algerian sort of case study is a little bit sui generis, although as we'll see, it's very, very important also for the way in which it kind of influenced the subsequent history of colonization in Morocco and Tunisia. And then finally, the rest of present-day Algeria, more or less, the Algerian Sahara was conquered in 1881. But interestingly, the Jews there was a not enormous, but significant Jewish population in the Sahara. They had a very different trajectory, and I'll explain what I mean later. Now, again, I'm going to kind of shamelessly simplify things a little bit, but I tend to think of the history of colonialism in general, particularly of French colonialism, as existing somewhat along the spectrum, right? On one end of the spectrum are those French politicians for whom the expansion of France's colonial empire was justified by a genuine ideological belief that France had a role in shaping the future of civilization, that France, being the birthplace of enlightenment and democracy, and that it had bestowed the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity to the world. And thus it was sort of France's duty to essentially spread this enlightenment to less enlightened populations, to less civilized parts of the world. So, and this is often summed up as the civilizing mission, the mission civilisatrice. Of course, it had its English equivalent, summed up best by Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden, right? And this was, to a certain extent, part of the way that some French people at least thought about colonization. But there was also the other end of the spectrum, in which conquest was not about civilizing, because many French people did not believe in the possibility of civilizing non-Western peoples. And there was this sense of sort of, true disconnect, often along racial lines, between Europeans who were inherently superior and non-Europeans, Arabs, to a certain extent Jews. Of course, the exact boundaries of who counted as European was always up for debate. But these racist theories about the sort of, inevitable domination of brown people by white people were also a big part of the experience of colonization, and often, went along with these very racist beliefs, especially about Muslims, to some extent about Jews, but much more about Muslims, that Muslim Arabs in Algeria and elsewhere were barbaric, fanatical, dangerous, and that they were sort of, infantile in the sense that the French had to kind of put them in a kind of dependent relationship. Now, the racism of these sort of, you could almost call them anti-civilizing mission colonizers, was not totally lost on Jews, and many of them did kind of lump Jews in with other Arabs. In fact, many Jews were called Arabs of the Jewish faith, and there's an excellent book by that name by Joshua Schreier on the history of French colonization and sort of the civilizing mission in Algeria when it comes to Jews. But on the whole, and again, this is not across the board, but on the whole, French officials and colonizers perceived Algerian Jews as much better candidates for benefiting from France's civilizing mission than Muslims, right? This was in part because the French had this, not just the French, but most Europeans had this very entrenched view of the Muslim world as a place where non-Muslims were oppressed, and they saw their role in part as coming in as the great saviors who were going to liberate the oppressed non-Muslims from their Muslim overlords. And so Jews were sort of seen as, people who were suffering at the hands of the fanatical Muslims, but who themselves might be sort of rehabilitated. This also had something to do with the attitude of Jews. Jews generally were seen, at least, as far more willing to cooperate with French colonizers, unlike Muslims, who were presumed to be sort of determined to resist colonization. There was a grain of truth in this, in the sense that Jews went from being a minority under Muslim rule to being a minority under French rule, but it is only a grain of truth, because of course there were Jews who were very willing to cooperate with colonizers, and there were Jews who weren't, and there were Muslims who were willing to cooperate with their colonizers, and there were Muslims who weren't. But I would say in large part, and perhaps most importantly, it was the efforts of French Jews on behalf of their co-religionists in Algeria that really made the Jews of Algeria sort of the object of this civilizing mission, and generally convinced French administrators, colonial administrators, that Jews were civilizable and that Jews could be the kind of linchpin in France's efforts to bring civilization to Algeria. And this is where perhaps the most significant event in the history of colonial Algeria when it comes to Jews, this is the context in which that fits. So this man named Adolphe Crémieux was responsible for giving a huge boost to this desire to assimilate Algerian Jews to French Jews. In 1870, he became briefly Minister of Justice, and he issued a decree which became known as the Crémieux Decree, which made all Jews in Algeria citizens of France, full citizens of France. And this made them gave them a very different status from Algerian Muslims. So Algerian Jews, after the Décret Crémieux, were able to vote in elections, both locally and nationally, and they could attend French schools, they could hold government positions, they had all of the civil and political rights that French people from the metropole and other colonizers who had got French nationality had. This was extremely different from Muslims, who had no political rights in the 19th century, who had very limited civil rights, extremely limited. In fact, they were under this sort of legal code called the Code de l'Indigène, the Code of Nativeness. And this really set Algerian Jews in particular on this trajectory of assimilation towards France. It did not happen overnight. In fact, if anything, it took decades and decades before it really had a sort of cultural effect, but it did eventually really differentiate the path of Algerian Muslims and Algerian Jews. I don't want to suggest that this meant that Algerian Jews were actually automatically the equals of French citizens from the metropole, and that there wasn't sort of lingering prejudice. There was enormous prejudice, and there, in fact, basically almost all French colonial administrators and French colonizers in Algeria immediately regretted the Crémieux decree, and essentially, first of all, they tried to limit it, and then it sort of became too late to reverse it at a certain point. But there were the accepted wisdom was this was a mistake and we must not repeat it when we colonize other places. I'll talk about that a little bit in Algeria and Tunisia. And also that these pesky Jews who now can vote are a problem because they're not sufficiently educated, because they're Jewish, because they're racially different from us. So all of the kind of prejudice that existed before didn't disappear with the Décret Crémieux, but there was this kind of legal fait accompli. There was this legal reality of citizenship that had been granted to Jews that really did change the trajectory. Okay, I want to now switch away from the history of direct colonization and talk more broadly about the ways in which French Jewish leaders and Jewish leaders to a certain extent across Europe were thinking much more broadly than just Jews in Algeria right around this period, right? And I will start by saying that Jews in France had thoroughly internalized the idea of the civilizing mission when it came to fellow Jews, and they wanted to help Jews in other parts of the world whom they saw as basically in need of enlightenment, whom they saw as remaining in a kind of civilizational backwardness. And this is where an organization called the Alliance Israélite Universelle comes in. The Alliance Israélite Universelle was founded in 1860. Here is a quote from its sort of initial manifesto titled The Appeal to All Israelites. Israelite, by the way, was just a polite term in French for Jew at the time. So Israelites, if you believe that those who are blind ought to be enlightened and not forsaken, and that those who are afflicted ought to be assisted and not merely pitied, that we should defend those who are calumniated and not look on with silent compassion, that we ought to give material aid to those who are persecuted and not simply cry and lament at their persecution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very flowery language. They loved that. Then, the upshot is please join the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And it, by the way, the first president was none other than Adolphe Crémieux, right? Who had this kind of outsized role in French politics, but also in the French Jewish community. Now, the Alliance had two main activities. They engaged in political advocacy, which is something that they're kind of forgotten for, but actually at the beginning of their existence, this was the more important role that they took on, and they were mainly concerned about anti-Semitism. And they also began this network of schools, of educational organizations, which turned out to have an extremely lasting and deep effect on Jews across North Africa and the Middle East. And the network of schools that they opened was truly enormous and impressive. Their first school was open. Here are some pictures, later pictures, because we don't have photographs. We don't have that many photographs from that very early period, but they opened their very first school in Morocco in 1862 in the town of Tétouan. First a school just for boys, and then 2 years later, a school for girls. And then they proceeded to open schools across the Islamic world, in Tunisia, in the Ottoman Empire, in Persia, Egypt, Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. The curriculum of the Alliance schools, which you could perhaps get a sense of just from these photographs, was very much an attempt to transmit the values and culture of France to Jewish children across the Middle East and North Africa. Most of the instruction was French, not all of it. They did have a few hours of Jewish studies, which was usually taught by local rabbis, and often only limited to boys. I mean, this was very strategic on the Alliance's part because they expected that they would get a lot of pushback if, first of all, they didn't include Judaic studies, and second of all, if they didn't allow local rabbis to continue to have control over that part of the curriculum. But this was not the focus. The focus was really about learning things like French language, French literature, history, geography, science, mathematics, etc. And to a certain degree, vocational training. There was a lot of vocational training involved in many Alliance schools, especially for girls, though not only. There, in many schools across the Middle East, and certainly in Morocco, at least I know this from my own sort of oral histories that I've conducted, these Jewish children were taught to repeat the famous French phrase, nos ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors the Gauls, which is the thing that like every school child in France learns to say, but of course, which is completely absurd for a child in Morocco or Tunisia or Iran or Istanbul to say. But there was this kind of intense Frenchification of Jews across North Africa and the Middle East at the time. Now, we have to remember that when this was happening, French culture was the international culture. French language was the international language in the same way I would say that American culture and the English language is today to a large degree. So you could sort of think of this as a more charitable equivalent of like the large network of American schools that exist all over the world, except that those American schools are largely aimed at elites, and these Alliance schools really weren't aimed at elites. I mean, some elites went, but they were really aimed in particular at poor children who couldn't necessarily afford to pay any sort of tuition. So they were really an incredible institutional undertaking. I mean, it's just, if you think about the sheer scale of the Alliance, it's really quite impressive. What this means ultimately is that before much of the Middle East and North Africa came under colonial rule, which not all of it did, but most of it did, many Jews had already encountered French culture, and they were already being influenced by French ideology. And this is something that really kind of had an impact in terms of the westernization of Jews, often distinct from and before colonization. Okay, let me say something about the colonization of Tunisia and Morocco. First of all, Tunisia had also been part of the Ottoman Empire before it was colonized in 1881. Now, we've been talking throughout this conference a lot about the status of Jews under Islamic rule and the status of Jews as Ahl al-Dhimma or Dhimmis. Something that is sort of important to know is that the Ottoman Empire formally abolished Dhimmi status in 1856. That doesn't mean that Jews were completely assimilated into the mass of Muslims and Christians, and that everybody had exactly the same status they're on, but the formal hierarchy that had for centuries put Muslims on top above Jews and Christians was no longer, at least formally, in power. And Tunisia had not adopted exactly the same decree in 1856, but it adopted a similar version of it in 1857, something called the Ahd al-Aman, which is usually translated as the Fundamental Pact in English. Now, Morocco was not part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Moroccan Sultan was determined not to succumb to the various pressures that had basically kind of forced the hand of Ottoman administrators in making Jews and Christians equal subjects. And so the Moroccan Sultan actually refused to abolish the status of Dhimmi, and the French didn't abolish it either when they colonized Morocco in 1912. In fact, the status of Dhimmis was technically not abolished until 1956 when Morocco became independent. So when France colonized Morocco and Tunisia, they, as I had sort of mentioned, they were very determined not to repeat what had happened in Algeria, and particularly not to repeat the mistake of the Crémieux decree. And they also did not want to annex these areas. They declared protectorates, which meant that they technically left the local governments in place, but they sort of, ruled sort of like a behind the scenes puppet, not so behind the scenes puppet. The Jews in Morocco and Tunisia, many of them really wanted the French to make them into French citizens as they had done in Algeria. But this was really a non-starter. The French were absolutely convinced the Crémieux decree had been a mistake. But what is nonetheless true is that even in Morocco and Tunisia, which were not annexed to France and where Jews were not made into French citizens, nonetheless, French colonial officials generally viewed Jews as being more easily assimilated. And of course, by the time Tunisia, not so much Tunisia, because the first Alliance school actually hadn't been created in Tunisia until the 1870s, and Tunisia was colonized in 1881. But in Morocco, certainly, where the first Alliance school had been created in 1862, and it wasn't colonized until 1912, you already had 50 years of Alliance activity. And of course, the network of Alliance schools had vastly expanded. This is actually a colonial map. So this is from a little bit later, but you can see that there were huge numbers of Alliance schools all over Morocco by the 20th century. So in short, when the French came to Morocco, they encountered a Jewish population that many of whom, not all, but many of whom were already thoroughly familiar with French culture, spoke French, were literate in French, and were excellent candidates for jobs in the colonial bureaucracy, for entry into the professions. So Jews in Morocco and Tunisia in particular became sort of overrepresented as lawyers and as doctors. And interestingly, in both Morocco and Tunisia, the French government actually began to subsidize the Alliance schools, and that's in part responsible for the absolutely enormous growth of Alliance schools in Morocco in particular, because essentially the French government sort of decided that rather than try to provide any kind of French education for Jews, they would just give a little bit of money to the Alliance and let the Alliance continue to do it. And so during the colonial period, huge numbers, it wasn't 100%, but huge numbers of Moroccan Jews were educated in Alliance schools. And this was a very stark contrast with the experience of Muslims under colonial rule. So in both Morocco and Tunisia, there were just a tiny number of French schools designed for local Muslims, and it was almost always restricted to Muslim elites. And the vast majority of Muslims did not have access to free or subsidized French education, which, basically meant that Jews were not only perceived as friendlier to the colonial enterprise, but were actually being actively trained to participate in the colonial enterprise by speaking French, whereas Muslims were being actively left out of that enterprise, again, with the exception of a very small number of Muslim elites. So this, I would say, and now again, I'm going to simplify a little bit, but if there is anything that you take away from this talk, that I hope that you will take away the enormous impact that educational policy had on the very different trajectories of Jews and Muslims in French North Africa. Okay, I promised I wouldn't only talk about North Africa, even though, of course, North Africa is the most interesting part of the entire world. But I do want to talk a little bit about Egypt and Iraq, which had very, very different experiences. Of course, they were both colonized by the British. Egypt was colonized not technically, but effectively in 1882, became part of the British Empire. Now, it was technically still part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Khedive, sort of the hereditary governor of Egypt, that had the dynasty that had started with Muhammad Ali in the early 19th century, technically remained in place. But it was sort of like the protectorates of Morocco and Tunisia. The British were the ones who actually had the power. Finally, in 1914, there was a sort of formal occupation. And then there was technical independence in the 20s, but again, the British were largely still in control. And it really, more or less, British colonialism lasted in Egypt until 1952. Now, the Jewish population of Egypt was quite distinct from really anywhere else in the Middle East and North Africa. Very fascinating to me. Obviously, we've heard about the Cairo Gazebo, so you all know already that Jews had been in Egypt, well, for a very long time, but certainly that there had been an important presence in the Middle Ages. But actually, the relative importance of the Jewish population in Egypt had somewhat sort of declined, in the sense that the population had not grown robustly, and their kind of prominence in trade had not been maintained. And there was probably something like only 4,000 Jews in Cairo in 1884. But this number exploded in a very short period of time, because Egypt was, the whole country was like a boom town, especially Cairo and Alexandria. And everybody was coming to Egypt from all over the world, all over Europe, certainly. Lots of non-Jews, lots and lots of Christians were flocking to Egypt, particularly from Southern Europe. So Italians, Greeks, and Maltese. The Maltese went everywhere, but they definitely went to Egypt. But also French, British, German, really everybody was going to Egypt. And Jews were included. Now, there were some Ashkenazi Jews who ended up in Egypt, and there was a, small but significant population of Ashkenazi Jews in Egypt. But the majority of the Egyptian Jewish community, which grew, again, exponentially in the late 19th century, came from other parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And in some ways, the Jewish community of Egypt is really more of a kind of almost like a Frankenstein Middle Eastern North African Jewish community, because it had all these influences from Persia, from Iraq, from Greater Syria, from the Anatolia and the Balkans, from Tunisia, from Algeria, from Morocco, and all of these Jews would come and intermarry, and then there was this really kind of fascinating in some ways, a true melting pot, because these Jews would go to synagogue together, they would marry each other. And this was they produced this really interesting sui generis Egyptian Jewish community, which was really a combination of traditions and languages and beliefs from all over the Middle East or North Africa. This woman is this incredibly talented and wonderful author who, if you have not read her, again, the second thing you should come away from this talk with is that you must read Jacqueline Shohat-Kanoff. I particularly recommend her novel, Jacob's Ladder. Unfortunately, it's out of print. Excerpts of it can be found in a wonderful collection that was recently edited by Deborah Starr. But she writes these semi-autobiographical novels and stories. And one is about Jacob's Ladder, her most famous novel, is about this mixed family, half of which come from Iraq and half of which come from Tunisia, and they marry each other. And the kind of descriptions of the different Jewish cultures, this very uptight and stern and austere and proper Iraqi Jewish grandmother and grandfather versus these very garrulous and kind of hedonistic and loud and a little bit sloppy Tunisian grandparents. Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And this is in some ways, again, a kind of, to a large degree is a broader metaphor for the Egyptian Jewish community at the time. Also, the Egyptian Jewish community tended to be more Westernized than Jews almost anywhere else, in part because most of the migrants joined the middle and upper middle classes. So you did have a kind of working class Jewish community, Egyptian Jewish community, but there was more than elsewhere, there was a kind of overrepresentation of middle class and upper middle class and very, very wealthy Jews who were involved in trade, who were involved in, intermediaries between Europeans and locals, and who tended to be polyglots, right? Who would speak French and English and dialects of Arabic and maybe Ottoman, Turkish as well. And this was not dissimilar from the population of Muslims and Christians who lived in Egypt at the time. Well, and when I say Egypt, again, I mainly mean Cairo and Alexandria, where the vast majority of Jews were concentrated. But there was this almost sui generis culture that in large ways was shared among the upper middle class elites of all three religions, many of whom had come from elsewhere, a little bit less when it came to Muslims, but certainly many Christians who were Arabic speaking but had come from elsewhere, who would send their kids to British schools or French schools. The Alliance was active in Egypt, although it tended to serve more of the working class population, and the elite Egyptian Jews tended to send their children actually very often to Christian schools, to Protestant schools, or to Catholic schools, which of course caused no end of trouble in many families. Okay, and then let me just speak briefly about Iraq. Okay, so of course Jews had lived in Iraq. Well, maybe you don't know this, but Jews had lived in Iraq since the first exile in the 6th century BCE. So that is by far one of the oldest continuous Jewish populations in the world. And they had a very, very strong sense of place. Iraq was colonized rather late. It was part of the mandate system that created, the French mandate of Syria and the French mandates of Syria and Lebanon, the British mandates of Palestine, Jordan, what's called Transjordan, and Iraq. So technically formed in 1921. It became formally independent in 1932. There was still some British influence for a while afterwards, but it had one of the much shorter periods of colonial rule. And Jews in Iraq also had a very distinctive trajectory, in large part because they were by far, and again, this is mainly elites, but not only, they were by far the most Arabized community of any of the Jews in the modern Middle East and North Africa. They were educated in Arabic institutions along with Muslims and Christians. They were fluent in Arabic. And this, it's not only about language, but language is very, very central. This laid the foundation for Iraqi Jews to share in a political and cultural climate with fellow Muslims and Christians in a way that happened almost nowhere else in the Middle East and North Africa. So more than anywhere else, Iraqi Jews identified as Arabs or were interested in Arab nationalism, or certainly in Iraqi nationalism. They were, often very active in the anti-colonial movement, very, very active in the communist movement. That, again, this is not sui generis. There were Jewish communists in Egypt, there were Jewish communists in Morocco, but in Iraq, this was all on a much bigger scale. And there was really a kind of, in some ways unique in the modern Middle East, shared elite culture, in particular, of political and cultural engagement in the Arabic sphere and the Arabic world, that Jews were very central to. And this is mainly this is really in the interwar period in the 1920s and 30s. It ended up being rather short-lived for reasons I'll talk about in a bit. Okay, I want to sort of pause here before I go on to talk a little bit about nationalism, just to say that, of course, everything that I've said so far about Westernization and colonization and all of that must all be taken with a grain of salt, because the vast majority of Jews across the region did continue to speak Arabic as their primary language. That was even in Algeria, where Jews had been, were starting to go to French schools as early as 1870, where Jews were French citizens. Even in Algeria, well into the 1930s and 40s, most, if not the vast majority of Jews, still spoke Arabic as their primary language. Many continued to dress in local clothes, eat local food. And, to a certain degree, there was a class divide here when it came to questions of acculturation. And there was still, I stick to my guns that the difference between Jews and Muslims in their relationship with the colonizers and their relationship with Western culture was stark. But I do not mean to give you the impression that all Jews across the Middle East and North Africa are sort of like, you turn a switch and everybody's becoming European. That is not how it happened at all. Okay. I want to talk now about nationalism, and I know I'm already going over my time and there's so much to say, but I'll just say briefly. First of all, that I think when we look at the history of nationalism in the modern Middle East, Zionism should be seen as one strand of nationalism. It should be integrated into that broader history. Secondly, this is a kind of interwar period. And, I think the thing to say is that certainly in North Africa, across North Africa, the majority of nationalists were Muslims and were largely claiming their anti-colonial position and their bid for independence in the name of Arabness and Islam. And this was something that did not universally exclude Jews, but often made it difficult for Jews to participate. Jews in North Africa, unlike Iraqi Jews, who many, and even some Egyptian Jews, but Jews in North Africa really did not identify as Arab for the most part, for reasons that I can get into if you like in the Q&A. They, of course, spoke Arabic, but they didn't think of themselves as Arabs. And there was, in the same way that the colonizers had sort of picked Jews to be their kind of special friends and the ones who were going to be easier to assimilate, many Muslims perceived Jews as the sort of special friends of the French, the special friends of the colonizers. This was especially true in Algeria, of course, where Jews were French citizens, but it was also true to a large extent in Morocco and Tunisia, where again, Jews spoke, many more Jews spoke French, Jews went to French schools, many more Jews worked for the French government or in other kind of French endeavors like the law, et cetera, et cetera. And this was a little bit different in Egypt. There certainly early on, there were very prominent Egyptian Jews who were involved in the nationalist movement, in the anti-colonial movement. This guy, Yaqub Sano, was known for coining the phrase Egypt for the Egyptians, or at least that's accredited to him. But, I also, so it's not, again, and that's true also in North Africa, that there were Jews who were involved in the nationalist movements. But I would say even in Egypt, especially among the sort of Europeanized, Westernized Jewish elite, there was a sort of alienation from nationalism and anti-colonialism. There's this wonderful excerpt from Shohei Kanaf's Jacob's Ladder, which I'll just read. One afternoon, when this is about a Jewish family, of course, when they had friends for tea, including the young Karims and the Hakims, these Muslim, there's a typo there, these Muslim families, and played in the garden, a band of young riders passed by shouting Egypt for the Egyptians. So this is a nationalist movement. In a sudden burst of determination, Rachel, this Jewish child, ran to the gate, snatching some flowers on her way and throwing them to the riders, shouted back, Egypt for the Egyptians. Miss Nutting, her very severe and much hated British nanny, called out sharply, come here at once. Rachel obeyed, and Miss Nutty snapped, how dare you do such a thing, scolding her publicly, a grown girl. And then there proceeds to be this big sort of, confrontation. But the presumption is that in Rachel's educated elite Jewish family, right, they really have nothing to do with the nationalist movement. And, her sort of impulsive interest in it is sharply condemned. Now, interestingly, the fact that Jews were largely, not completely, but largely alienated from nationalist movements in North Africa and Egypt. Again, not in Iraq. Iraq was really an exception, and many Jews were very involved in nationalism there. But this did not mean that they were involved in Zionism, that was their alternative nationalist movement. On the contrary, Zionism really wasn't particularly widespread in North Africa or the Middle East before World War I, or even in there was, in the interwar period, it grew a little bit. And, there were ways in which some Jews were active in Zionist circles. Some Jews did make Aliyah, but it remained a minority position, not only because the Alliance had initially been extremely opposed to Zionism. And then even once the Alliance sort of stepped back, there was still this sense that Zionism was really, not for Jews in the Middle East or North Africa. Okay, I was going to say a word about World War II in North Africa and the Middle East, but I definitely don't have time, so I will just skip that. I want to talk a little bit about the departure of Jews. And again, I really here want to emphasize just how different the experiences of different places were. So Morocco and Tunisia had relatively similar experiences. And right after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, there were large groups of Moroccan and Tunisian Jews who went to Israel. This is one of these histories that is widely debated and people really disagree. But, I would just say from my perspective, there were a few who had strong Zionist convictions, but most had not previously been involved in Zionist organizations. Most went for a combination of religious reasons, a kind of messianic belief in and a desire to live in the Holy Land, and for economic opportunities, especially at the beginning. The vast majority of Jews who went from North Africa were extremely poor, and this was seen as a way to escape their really desperate poverty. Later on, it tended to be more common for Jews to leave North Africa for Israel out of fear for their future in sort of independent North African states. And that was something of a consideration right after 1956 when Morocco and Tunisia became independent. Very few Algerian Jews went to Israel, almost none. The vast majority, 98%, went to France because they were French citizens and they were sort of automatically, quote, repatriated to France. the experience of Jews in Iraq is very different. And it's quite, in some ways, it's one of these sort of historical ironies, because of course, Iraq had the Jewish community that was most Arabized, most involved in the nationalist movement. And yet, all of a sudden, after the partition of Palestine and the creation of the state of Israel, there was a kind of very extreme anti-Zionist, which very quickly shaded over into just an anti-Jewish position taken by the Iraqi government and by a large number of Iraqis. And many Jews were persecuted for alleged Zionism, sometimes just for being Jewish. Jews were barred from government jobs, from universities, et cetera. And finally, in 1950-51, the Iraqi government negotiated the massive airlift of, again, the vast majority of its Jewish community to Israel. And something like 95% of Iraqi Jews left at that moment. So there was this really sort of extreme shift from a Jewish community that had been very deeply embedded in Iraqi culture and society in the 20s and 30s. Even in the 40s, this is the Farhud was mentioned, and this is again something that historians debate, but many historians think that the Farhud was something of a blip in 41, and that afterwards actually things went more or less back to the way they had been in the 20s and 30s, and that it was much more a kind of thing, a shift post 47, and then of course 48, that really made things untenable for Jews in Iraq. Okay, I should say something about Egypt, but I don't want to go on. So I'll just leave you with a couple of images of Jews in, oops, wait, sorry, somehow this is not working. Okay, never mind. So well, with that, Lior, I'll leave it to you and I'll figure out how to get out of the slideshow. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. And I think that it's this session is so incredibly useful in dismantling the notion that there was a Jewish experience in the Middle East and North Africa in the 19th and 20th century. And also it counters the oversimplified narrative that is often told about the end of Jewish history in the Middle East came about in 1948 after the establishment of Israel, and this was the end, and this was the cause and the reason and the end result of everything. So this your presentation was extremely useful in countering it, and also to show how colonialism, there's something to be said about the condition of Jews in the semi-colonial states, semi-colonial and colonial states, and how they could no longer live in the post-colonial states. And what happened in this transition that didn't happen from the conditions, whatever they were in the pre-colonial states, to the colonial or semi-colonial state. Jessica is very correct to offer or demand resistance to teleology, because it's important to see why every Jewish community or communities from specific countries had to live in certain points in time. And I just want to, it's useful, I think, to mention the specific cases. I'll start with Egypt because you finished with Egypt. The majority of the community did not live after 1948. In fact, when in 1952, after the revolution that brought the free officers to power and the establishment of the republic, the leadership of the republic pretty much wanted to see the Jewish community staying in the country because of its major role in the Egyptian economy. And in Rosh Hashanah, shortly after the revolution took place in July. In Rosh Hashanah, the first president of the republic, Muhammad Naguib, visited 3 Cairan synagogues as a show of solidarity with the Jews, and to pretty much show them that this is the place for them to stay. The exodus from Egypt took place in 1956, following very condensed period of events like the Susanna operation, that the Mossad recruited spies from within the Egyptian Jewish communities and assigned them to explode American and British government delegation buildings, the Suez crisis, the dawn of the ultra-nationalist xenophobic era under Sadat, that led to the explosion of over 100,000 foreign nationals, and only part of them were Jews. So we have to put it in context that when the Jews lived, it wasn't expulsion of the Jews from Egypt, it was expulsion of all foreign nationals. And as Jessica explained, many of them were not Jewish Egyptian nationals. They were Greek, Italian, Russians. So this was part of the larger trend. So again, we see that the transition to the post-colonial state actually prevented the continuation of the Jewish community there. The same thing happened in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Every time we see the Jewish community leave after independence. Lebanon, it was during the crisis of the civil war, and Iraq, as you said, was after this agreement of Ben Gurion and Nouri Said on the right of the Iraqi government to keep the property of Iraqi Jews. Interestingly, I'm those who don't know, I study Iran, and about 15,000 of the Iraqi Jews that immigrated to Israel in the next 5 years moved to Iran, because they did not, Israel was not a good fit for them culturally, sociologically, politically, and many of them chose to relocate to Tehran because they couldn't go back to Iraq. So they chose the second best, which was Tehran. And so again, it's just to show that Israel was not, that the establishment of Israel did not end or did not offer immediately redemption, political redemption to the Jewish communities. And I'm going to keep my comments very, very short, so we'll have enough time to the Q&A. And I see that we have some questions already there. And this is, I want to talk about the issue of Zionism among the Jewish communities in the region. And I want to follow up on what Jessica said, that Zionism did not become prominent movement among Middle Eastern Jews, which is true, but there's also another angle of it, which is that even when they did support Zionism in various forms, they had different understanding of Zionism. They did not think of Zionism as something, and again, I'll take it to the case of Iran, because interestingly, even though the Jewish community survived the transition to the post-colonial state, and part of it is because I think this interpretation of Zionism, that Zionism is a good development for Jews who cannot stay in their homelands. And they were talking about the Russian Jews and the Eastern European Jews that had to leave because of pogroms and then the Holocaust, but it didn't apply to them. They could stay in Iran, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Lebanon. Zionism was overall a good development, but for the European Jews, not for them. And I think that when we analyze the Zionist discourse from the Zionist organizations on the Middle Eastern Jews and the Middle Eastern Jews on Zionism, we see that there is a total disconnect between the two understanding of the concept of Zionism. Last thing that I'm going to say, again, to leave time for the Q&A, I was intrigued by the by what had happened with the Crimea decree and its impact on Morocco and Tunisia, because we knew that that there was no implementation of this decree elsewhere. But when you add to it that it was because of the failure, quote unquote, of the Crimea decree in Algeria, it made it so much more interesting, because first of all, focusing on Algeria itself, we know that there were from the works that you mentioned, Josh Ryer and Joshua Cole, that even in the early stages of French colonialism, there were offered multiple tracks of French nationalism. So it wasn't just the full citizenship that was given to Jews and then no citizenship to the Algerian Arabs, but there were various options in between. And I wonder, first of all, if the understanding or the recalculation of the Crimea decree had any influence on French policies in Algeria, and then if it served any role in defining the French colonial rule in Morocco and Tunisia. And then you talked about it more in the talk, but I'm still curious if it was overall seen as a failure. Why did they still support or subsidize the AIU, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, in the places that they did not want the Jews to assimilate? I'm going to end here. I have plenty more to say, but I'll keep it to the next conference. If you want to respond quickly, and then we'll pick up questions.
Okay, yeah, no, this is great. And I basically I'm going to say yes to everything you said, absolutely. And maybe I'll just add on the question of Zionism and the particular form that Zionism took in the Middle East and North Africa. I would just maybe add a slight precursor, which is that in the very late and 19th and early 20th century in the Ottoman Empire, there was what Michel Campos has called Ottoman Zionism, which was really not just, was even maybe yet a third option. It wasn't seeing Zionism as a response that was really appropriate for European Jews, and thus, Middle Eastern Jews would support in solidarity with their co-religionists in Europe who were really suffering. But Ottoman Zionism was often really a cultural movement that refused the state-based claims. And we have to remember that even mainstream Zionism for a very long time were themselves confused about whether they really wanted a state, or did they want an autonomous territory, or what did they want, right? And Ottoman Zionists were often very vociferous in saying that we are Zionist, but that for us is a cultural regeneration that involves the sort of reclamation of our sort of national rights as part of the Ottoman Empire. And so, yes, and there are actually maybe many more iterations of this. And I think that this is part of what is so important about the history of Jews in the modern Middle East, is precisely to disrupt the kind of homogenizing narratives that we get, which tend to be inflected with the European and American experiences. The questions about the Crimea decree, absolutely, and we could go on and talk about this, but I will keep it brief, which is basically just to say that I think the desire not to repeat the effects of the mistakes of the Crimea decree were embedded in a broader sense that the direct colonization of Algeria had been largely a mistake and a failure, and that it was too expensive, and that it was too difficult, and that the Algerians were always troublesome, and that is part of why the French implemented this protectorate model, where they were like, okay, well, we're not going to directly colonize them. We're going to leave their institutions in place, but we'll sort of improve things and run things from the mind. So they were trying to have their cake and eat it too, in some ways, and to a certain degree they did. But it's interesting. It's funny that, like, today, I've talked to French people who sort of have the sense that Tunisia and Morocco weren't colonized because they were protectorates. but they definitely were colonies in the sense of being part of the French Empire and in the sense of the French holding all the power. So the French were very successful in their propaganda in getting their version of events sort of out. But I think that actually the sort of wariness about Jews goes with this broader wariness about sort of, trying to have too heavy of a hand in their other North African colonies. Okay, we should turn to questions from the audience, because that's of course the most fun.
Okay, so let's start. Okay, this is an interesting one. I've always wanted to know why European colonization is treated as uniquely oppressive as compared to other subjugations, the Hellenic Empire, Roman Empire, and even the Ottoman Empire. I attribute it myself to Edward Said's definition of Orientalism. This may have come up earlier when I wasn't able to be present. The consequence I see is that non-Western oppression in modern times by the USSR, China, Japan, India, etc., is somehow given a free pass, particularly on the left. You want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that first of all, I think there is an increasing sort of inclination among scholars to study empires as a comparative perspective. And there's one book that I teach with by Jane Burbank and Fred Cooper called Empires in World History, which does this and starts from the Romans and goes all the way to the USSR and the Cold War. And, I think it is absolutely important not to think of European empire as the only kind of empire or as so much more oppressive and horrific than any other empire ever. Nonetheless, I do think, and again, this is a bit of a simplification, but certainly when it comes to the pre-modern, the pre-19th century empires, the element of racialization and racism that really was a huge part of the European imperial project in the 19th century, both on both ends of that spectrum that I set up of the pro-civilizing mission, we've got to civilize them, which is of course a very racist position, and on they're uncivilizable, it's hopeless, we're just going to rule over them end of the spectrum. But that presumption of European superiority, again, it's not completely different from the early modern versions, but the volume got turned up in a really important way in the 19th century, which of course was bolstered by new racial science, by a new kind of approach to a biological understanding of race and civilization and civilizational hierarchy. And I do think that this, I hate the word unique, so I try not to use it, but I'm trying to constantly get my students to stop using it. But I think this was oppressive in a different way and had different effects from previous empires. Now, many post-European, post-colonial, continuations of empire continue to have, so I am not a scholar of the USSR or China or Japan or India, so that's largely why I don't talk about those places. But I certainly wouldn't preclude similar discussion. I mean, I happen to have lived in India, and so I'm a little bit more familiar with what's going on in India right now. And I think Hindu nationalism is a very excellent example of the kinds of oppression that were, sort of very evident in the French Empire and the British Empire in the Middle East and North Africa.
All right, that's I think that this is a good enough answer.
It's a big question, so yes, that is only the beginning of an answer.
When Jews were educated by French, were there any early women doctors, lawyers, etc., from this educated early group?
That is an excellent question. So I will say, and will give me a chance to say something that I didn't have time to kind of emphasize as much as I would have liked in the presentation, that in some ways the revolution of the Alliance was way more stark for women, for girls in the Middle East and North Africa, for Jewish girls who generally, I would say almost, across the board, did not receive formal education under traditional Jewish methods of schooling, and who began to receive formal education in huge numbers. So this was a gendered revolution that absolutely did transform the nature of gender relations, the nature of ideas about education and women's place in society and all of that. Not necessarily, they weren't all feminists in the way that we would think of them today, and they didn't believe necessarily in the equality of men and women, but there was this belief that women should be educated, often in a very sort of middle class bourgeois context, where women who were going to be the educators of the children needed themselves to be educated, right? And that this was sort of the way of spreading civilization. But it did produce, not at the very beginning for the most part, but by the interwar period, it did produce women who went into professions. And in fact, there's a wonderful book that is either about to come out or just came out by Susan Miller on one of the most influential and famous Moroccan Jewish women lawyers, a woman named Helen Kazes Benatar, who, was one of the few women who really made it in the profession of law in Morocco, and then used that expertise in incredible ways to be this absolutely fantastic advocate for refugees during World War II in Morocco. And I can't recommend this book enough. I was able to read it before it was published, and it is a gripping, it's like a thriller, and she is one of those people that you can't believe has not been written about already. So yes, I mean, the short answer is this did happen. It tended not to happen in the 19th century. It's more of a 20th century phenomenon. And of course, just like there's still a wage gap and there's still a gendered gap in professions today, there was very much one even in the interwar period. But this was the beginning of a true, a revolution in the way that Jewish women experienced education across the Middle East and North Africa.
I second the recommendation, of course. Check it out on Stanford University Press website. Is there any resistance among Jews of Algeria to French culture? In the case of Algeria, there are examples of Rabbi Youssef Renassia, who translated the Bible into Judeo-Arabic from Constantine. Also, the Andalusian music is symbolic of Sephardic culture and its continuity in Algeria.
That's such a good question. So, first of all, I'm not sure that the continued use of Judeo-Arabic and the very strong through line of Andalusian music, not only in Algeria, but especially in Algeria, I'm not sure I would necessarily interpret those as resistance to French culture. I see them more as very, very strong persistence of local Algerian Judeo-Arabic culture, language, that again, really, as I tried to kind of mention, but these are excellent concrete examples that lasted not just after 1870, but well into the 20th century. And it is actually something that we still don't understand as well as we should. And so for any of you out there who are considering PhDs, it's not necessarily a great job market, but if you're able to dedicate 6 years of your life to writing a PhD, we need to know more about these questions. And this is one of those open questions where I would say we don't necessarily understand as well as we might just how Frenchicization of Algerian Jews happened and at what pace. And of course, it was different in different places. Big cities happened faster, et cetera, et cetera. I will just say that this isn't necessarily resistance either, but there was certainly concern, especially among the rabbinic elites, about secularization and about the decline in religious learning. And in fact, so the Alliance never opened full-on schools in Algeria because by the time the Alliance existed, essentially, the Décret Crémieux had opened French schools to Algerian Jews. But what they did open later in the 19th century were these essentially Hebrew schools, after-school programs, because even the Alliance was concerned that all of these Algerian Jews weren't getting a Jewish education. They were like, this is not good. They need to learn Hebrew. They need to learn how to pray. So there was certainly, I wouldn't necessarily classify it as resistance, but there was certainly deep concern, but certainly among the rabbinical elite, but also among the most sort of pro-French of all of them, the Alliance, that the Décret Crémieux had sort of done too much for Frenchicizing the Jewish community, and that there needed to be a kind of preservation of Hebrew and of Jewish studies and of Jewish culture.
And I'll say, I don't know if this is exactly, if it answers the question, but in Joshua Schreier's book, there is a chapter that I assigned to my students on the case of one Jew that opposed the acceptance or the imposition of the French law on him as an Algerian Jew
Yes.
when he was not allowed to marry
Right.
a second wife.
Yes. Yes. True. Yes.
A very interesting example of cultural resistance, I think.
Right, right. Well, I would actually say that's more legal resistance. I think there was a lot of resistance among Jews against the inability to divorce and the inability to practice polygamy, which were both allowed under Jewish law and not allowed under French law. Which of course went into effect in 1870 kind of more or less overnight. And that also is something that I think is open for, there's actually a graduate student in Israel who's starting to work on this, which I think is very important because we need to know more about the rabbinic response to this really dramatic change in the legal status of Jews. Jewish law, the inability to divorce is a big deal for Jews because divorce is something that Jews had been able to do and is really, sort of central to Jewish law of marriage.
Yeah. All right. Please discuss the attitude of the Muslim community and the Muslim governments towards Zionism and the existence of a sovereign Jewish Israel.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I did leave that out. It's a small issue. Again, I won't be able to do it justice, but the short answer is that by the time of the partition of Palestine and the creation of the state of Israel, the anti-colonial movement the anti-colonial movements and the various nationalist movements across North Africa and the Middle East had largely already sort of sided with the Palestinians and against the Zionist move to try to create a Jewish state in Palestine. And there was, general consensus that Zionism was a colonialist endeavor and that, basically it wasn't the problem of the Palestinians to solve the woes of Jews in Europe, that they had not created the Holocaust or all of the anti-Semitism that came before that, and that they were essentially being punished by the British and then by the UN for crimes that they did not commit. And so there was a, pretty, again, with exceptions, but pretty across the board sense that Zionism was wrong. Now, this did not necessarily everywhere translate into an anti-Jewish sentiment. It did in places like Iraq, again, not among everybody, but there was a kind of overwhelming official and popular sense that Jews and Zionists were one thing. But in Morocco, there was, for instance, which is both on the other end of the geographical spectrum and on the other end of the sort of historical spectrum when it comes to the history of departure of Jews, the Moroccan government made an incredibly concerted effort to distinguish between Jews and Zionists, and even the kind of mainstream Moroccan Nationalist Party, which was very much sort of based on the idea of Islam and an Arab nation for Muslims. Nonetheless, the Istiqlal Party made a concerted effort to essentially say Moroccan Jews are distinct from Zionists and we must not conflate the two. Now, there were people who did conflate them, and there was anti-Jewish violence, and there was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment, which was entirely wrapped up with anti-Zionism and broader anti-colonialism. But the official line of the Moroccan state was from the beginning and continues to be today that Zionism and Moroccan Jews are two different things, and that Moroccan Jews have a place in the Moroccan nation. And this was the official line upon independence. And there was a concerted effort to bring certain Jews into the government, right, in 1956. Of course, this didn't convince everybody, most notably the vast majority of Moroccan Jews who left, but it's nonetheless worth pointing out.
All right, in 60 seconds or less, was Napoleon's liberation of Jews in Europe an outcome or precursor of the movement you described?
Okay, well, it's more of a precursor. So yes, what Napoleon did, this kind of pure emancipation, inaugurated this essentially French tradition of seeing themselves as the liberators of Jews, and which then was part of why French Jews lobbied so hard to make Algerian Jews into French citizens, and was part of what was behind the AIU. But we could put Napoleon as an outcome too of a broader kind of undercurrent of understanding of Enlightenment ideology and ideas about equality and all of that. So, but it's an excellent question, and Napoleon is definitely part of the story.
All right. Unfortunately, do we have time for the last one, or
you can try it very quickly, and then we'll move on. It could be a good segue for the next session.
So, Jessica, culturally, we were North African Jews involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Why did they bear the tax of the conflict that was not connected to their home region?
Well, again, I think that it was connected in the sense that even the Moroccan nationalist movement had aligned with the Palestinian, with Palestinian nationalism and with anti-Zionist sentiment, and so it was part of their world. And there was a sense that the questions at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were questions that were of great concern for Muslims across the region, and thus they became of great concern for Jews across the region. And I think in the same way that today we see Palestinian solidarity as something that goes well beyond even just Muslims, or certainly just Arabs, but just Muslims. To some people, that's something that doesn't make any sense, but to other people, that's a result of a broader sort of anti-colonial ideology that continues to be important for many people in the world. In the same way that Zionism is important for Jews who don't live in Israel across the world. Again, not all Jews, but many Jews, and that's the way things go in our globalized world, whether we like it or not.
All right. Thank you so much, both Jessica and Lior, for very informative, very rich. We'll have to think more about most of the questions, but now we're going to try to connect the beginning of the conference, in a sense, historically speaking, with the contemporary movements